The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin like a second layer, suffocating and heavy. Streetlights flickered over cracked pavement, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched across the near-empty parking lot of a quiet gas station. The world here moved at a different pace, slow, watchful, filled with the kind of silence that wasn't truly empty. It was a silence that held something in its grip, a silence that waited. Isaiah Bennett stood next to his car, the metallic gleam of his navy blue Dodge Challenger reflecting the artificial glow of the buzzing overhead lights. He had stopped here for something simple. A bottle of water, maybe, a snack for the road. But as he stepped toward the entrance of the convenience store, he felt it. That shift in the air, the weight of unseen eyes. He knew this feeling. It was the same one he'd learned to recognize in the army, stationed overseas, where uncertainty could mean danger. It was the same quiet tension he'd felt walking into certain rooms, certain towns, where his uniform didn't always shield him from judgment. His 6'2" frame carried the confidence of a soldier, the quiet composure of a man who had seen war. But here, in his own country, his own hometown, that composure often had to work double time. Inside the store, a young cashier barely looked up from her phone as he entered. The cold air conditioning was a welcome relief from the sweltering night, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. He walked past the aisles methodically, grabbing a sports drink, a protein bar. Simple things, everyday things. And yet, the way the man at the counter near the cigarette rack glanced his way, quick, sharp, unreadable, made his grip tighten just slightly around the plastic bottle. Outside, the low, guttural hum of a police cruiser rolling to a stop sent a ripple through his senses. Isaiah wasn't the kind of man to assume the worst. He was raised on discipline, on the belief that if you did what was right, you had nothing to fear. But life had taught him a different lesson, one that gnawed at the edges of that belief like slow corrosion. He paid in cash, nodded a silent thank you to the cashier, and stepped back outside, where the night seemed to have gotten even heavier. That was when he saw him. A police officer, white young, mid-30s maybe, standing just a few feet from his car. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, his stance wide, feet planted firmly, as if bracing for something. Isaiah felt the shift immediately. The air thickened with an unspoken tension. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, controlled. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes flicked toward Isaiah's license plate, then back to his face, scanning him as if trying to place him in some unspoken category. "Got a call about a suspicious vehicle in the area," the officer said finally, his tone neutral. But there was something else there, something colder beneath the surface. Isaiah exhaled slowly. "Suspicious? I just stopped for a drink." He gestured lightly toward the bag in his hand, keeping his movements measured, deliberate. The officer didn't budge. "License and registration." There it was. The test. The moment where choices narrowed, where the wrong breath, the wrong glance, the wrong hesitation could turn the night into something else entirely. Isaiah had been here before, in different ways, under different circumstances. And every time, it was the same question pounding against the inside of his ribs. What do I do to make it home tonight? He moved carefully, slow and clear. "It's in the car," he said. "I'm reaching for it now." The officer's fingers twitched near his weapon. "Go ahead." Isaiah opened the driver's side door, keeping one hand visible as he reached for his wallet. A shadow moved in the reflection of his car window, quick, sudden, a shift of weight, a shift of power, then the click, the unmistakable, heart-stopping sound of a gun being drawn. "Hands up, now!" The words hit like a gunshot themselves, ricocheting through Isaiah's body, sending a surge of adrenaline through his veins. He froze. The world seemed to narrow to the barrel of the gun, now aimed directly at him, inches from his chest. The officer's hand trembled, just slightly, but the intent was clear. Isaiah raised his hands slowly, pulse thundering in his ears. "Officer," his voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that only came from years of knowing how quickly things could go wrong. "I am a United States Army veteran. I am reaching for my wallet, that's all." The officer's breath was sharp, uneven. His eyes flickered with something: panic, control, power, fear. Then a voice cut through the night. "You're making a mistake." A second officer, older, heavier, stepping forward from the shadows near the cruiser. His expression was unreadable, but there was something final in his voice. The younger officer hesitated, but the gun didn't lower. The night held its breath. The moment stretched too long, too thin, like a rope about to snap. Isaiah didn't move. He knew better than to move. And then sirens, more blue and red lights flashing against the darkness, more shadows spilling into the lot. A decision would have to be made, and Isaiah had no idea which way it would go. Isaiah's breath stayed even, but his mind raced. Every nerve in his body was locked in place, every instinct screaming at him to hold still. He'd faced life or death moments before, on foreign soil, in combat zones where the enemy was clear, where the rules of engagement were drilled into his bones. But here, in the country he fought for, the battlefield was different. The enemy wasn't always clear, and the rules? They shifted with every glance, every wrong move, every assumption. His father had warned him about moments like this. "You can do everything right, son, and still lose. Just make sure you come home." He had been 14 the first time. He saw his father tense up during a traffic stop, knuckles white against the steering wheel, his voice calm but tight as he answered the officer's clipped questions. Isaiah had sat in the passenger seat, watching, learning. His father, a hard-working man who never raised his voice, had nodded, obeyed, waited until the officer left before finally exhaling. That night, over the dinner table, his father had looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You are not allowed to make mistakes." The words had settled deep, an unshakable truth he carried with him through high school, through boot camp, through every deployment. And now, here he was, hands up, gun aimed at his chest, waiting to see if his fate had already been decided. So, older officer stepped forward again, this time with more authority. "Stand down." His voice was firm, unwavering. The younger officer's grip wavered. For a split second, Isaiah saw it, the hesitation, the brief flicker of uncertainty in the man's eyes. Then the second officer spoke again, slower this time. "You need to think real hard about what you're doing right now." The younger cop blinked, his fingers still hovering too close to the trigger. Then, finally, he lowered the gun. The breath Isaiah hadn't realized he was holding slowly leaked out of him, but he didn't move. Not yet. The tension in the air didn't vanish, but it shifted, the unspoken battle now between the two officers. The older one, a veteran of the force, shook his head in something like disappointment. "Holstering a weapon isn't enough to fix what you just did." Isaiah swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to demand an answer, an apology, an explanation. But he knew none of those things would come, at least not now. The moment passed in a blur. More officers arrived. Voices murmured. The younger officer was pulled aside. Someone asked Isaiah for his ID, this time without a weapon in his face. He gave it, watching the way their eyes darted between his name and his military ID, as if it changed anything, as if it should have changed anything. Minutes stretched into an eternity before someone muttered, "You're free to go." No apology, no acknowledgement, just go. Isaiah stared at them for a long moment, his jaw tight. The urge to say something, to fight, to demand justice burned inside him, but another voice echoed in his mind. Just make sure you come home." So he did. Isaiah's apartment was small, modest, but neat. His army duffel bag sat in the corner, unpacked from his last trip home. The walls were mostly bare, save for a few framed photos. One of his mother and father on their wedding day, another of him in uniform, standing alongside his closest friend Malik during their last deployment. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing a hand down his face, replaying the night over and over, every detail, every breath, every second where he could have died over nothing. His phone buzzed. A message from Malik. Malik. "Heard what happened? You good?" Isaiah exhaled sharply. Malik had always been quick to pick up on things, even from miles away. Isaiah. "Yeah, long night." A moment later, his phone rang. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to talk about it, but Malik wouldn't let it go. "Man, I swear, every time I hear about another brother almost getting shot, my stomach drops." Malik's voice was tight, edged with frustration. "And this time it's you?" Isaiah leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I did everything right, I know. Didn't matter." A pause. "It never does." Silence settled between them, heavy and familiar. Malik sighed. "You gonna report it?" Isaiah hesitated. The thought had crossed his mind, but he knew how these things went. The complaints, the statements, the endless waiting for internal investigations that rarely led anywhere. "It won't change anything," Isaiah muttered. "Man, you don't know that." Isaiah pinched the bridge of his nose. "You ever get tired of this fight?" Malik was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Every damn day, but we don't stop." Isaiah closed his eyes. He wanted to believe that. He really did. But right. Now all he wanted was to breathe without feeling the weight of a gun aimed at his chest. 2 days passed. Then 3. Then the news broke. Isaiah was in line at a coffee shop when his phone lit up with notifications. He frowned, unlocking it to find a flood of messages, texts, calls, even a few from numbers he didn't recognize. Then he saw the headline. White. Cop fired immediately after pointing gun at Black Army veteran. His stomach clenched. He scrolled down, eyes scanning the article. The police department had released a statement, calling the officer's actions unacceptable and citing failure to follow protocol. The article mentioned his name, his service, the footage from the gas station's security cameras. He had expected anger, but he hadn't expected this. He barely registered the barista calling his name as he scrolled further. Social media was ablaze. Some people were calling it justice. Others were furious the officer had been fired too quickly. Isaiah clenched his jaw. He didn't want to be a headline, didn't want to be another name attached to an incident like this. His phone rang. Malik again. "You see it?" Malik asked the moment Isaiah answered. "Yeah, a beat. They only fired him because the cameras caught everything," Malik muttered. "They don't fire people for almost killing us, just for getting caught doing it." Isaiah exhaled. "What happens now?" Malik was quiet for a second. "That's the real question, ain't it?" Isaiah stared out the window. The world kept moving, people coming and going, sipping coffee, living their lives, but his had changed. Isaiah stood in the small kitchen of his apartment, staring down at the coffee brewing on the counter. The comforting hiss and drip of the machine were the only sounds in the otherwise quiet space. The world outside felt distant now, as if his entire reality had narrowed to the confines of his apartment, the flashing headlines and the never-ending debate playing out in the public eye. The officer who'd pointed the gun at him was fired, yes, but it didn't feel like a win. It felt like another chapter in a story he'd been told all his life. Do the right thing, keep your head down, don't make waves. But what had that ever gotten him? He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the wave of frustration that had been gnawing at him for days. He was a soldier, a man trained to follow orders. But the fight he was facing now wasn't one he had the right training for. There were no clear lines, no commands to follow, only the constant, simmering tension of walking into rooms where the rules didn't apply to him in the same way they did to others. A knock on the door broke him from his thoughts. He turned quickly, his heart giving a sharp thud in his chest. Not expecting anyone, he opened it, and there stood Marcus, his old friend from high school, someone who had always kept a watchful eye on him. Marcus was the kind of guy who stayed out of trouble, who didn't get tangled in the mess Isaiah had found himself in. "You okay, man?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed. Isaiah nodded, though it didn't feel true. "Yeah, just trying to make sense of it all." Marcus stepped inside, his gaze scanning the small apartment before settling on Isaiah. "You see the latest on the news. The whole thing's blown up. Everyone's talking about you." Isaiah flinched at the mention of his name, the weight of it sitting heavy on his shoulders. "I didn't want that," he muttered. Marcus sighed and dropped down onto the couch, stretching out his legs. "I get it, but you gotta realize you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. This is bigger than you." "I didn't ask for this," Isaiah said, his voice tight with frustration. "I know, man. But sometimes the fight finds you. You've been trying to keep your head down, but this is bigger than just one bad cop." Marcus leaned forward, his tone becoming more serious. "You've got to decide what you stand for. You've got to figure out how much this matters to you." Isaiah looked away, his eyes clouding over. "I don't know what to believe anymore. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I could just do my time, do my job, and make it home." "You did," Marcus said, his voice softening. "But now it's about making sure everyone else gets home too." Isaiah ran a hand through his hair. His head was spinning. The pressure was crushing him, all of it. The attention, the expectations, the constant reminder that his every move mattered to everyone but him. His body had been through wars, but this felt like a different kind of battle, one with no end in sight. The tension between them grew heavier as Marcus's gaze lingered. "Look, man, I know it's hard, but you're not alone in this." Before Isaiah could respond, his phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting the moment. He glanced at it. Another news outlet. Another message from a random number. He opened the text. "We have footage of your incident. You're not going to want to see this, but you need to. It's not over." Isaiah's breath hitched. His hand trembled slightly as he stared at the screen. The words hung there in the quiet, like a threat that had just been whispered too close to his ear. He turned the phone over, as if the mere sight of it was too much to bear. Marcus noticed the shift in his demeanor. "What is it?" Marcus asked. "It's nothing," Isaiah said, voice flat, but the fear was there in his eyes. He didn't want to dive into this, not yet, not now. But Marcus wasn't the type to let things slide. "You sure? Because something tells me you're not telling me everything." Isaiah stood, turning toward the window. The city was alive outside, bustling and unaware of the fight he was facing. He pressed a palm to the cool glass, trying to steady himself. The news coverage wasn't the only thing escalating. There were whispers now, whispers about Isaiah's incident, whispers about the officer Shaw, but there was something more in the undercurrent, something darker. He turned back to Marcus, his voice low. "I've been getting calls, people asking questions, some I don't even know." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Questions about what?" Isaiah shook his head. "I don't know. But they're not just curious, they're looking for something." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, I don't know?" Isaiah said, frustration rising in his chest. I feel like I'm being watched, man, like every move I make is under a microscope." Before Marcus could respond, Isaiah's phone buzzed again. This time a name appeared on the screen. "Detective Sarah Wilkins." Isaiah hesitated before answering. He wasn't sure what to expect from the department now. The last time he'd spoken to anyone in law enforcement, it had been a moment of sheer uncertainty. He answered anyway. Isaiah. Bennett? Detective Wilkins' voice crackled through the phone. Yeah, this is him. I'm Detective Wilkins. I've been assigned to review your case. Can we meet? Isaiah's jaw tightened. I'm not interested in more questions. I've already said everything. This isn't about the incident, Mr. Bennett. It's about what happened afterward. Isaiah's pulse quickened. What do you mean? The officer you had the altercation with, the one who was fired, his partner didn't exactly agree. With that decision, the word sent a chill down Isaiah's spine. He had suspected it. He'd felt it in the air, the tension from the other officers. This wasn't over. We believe you may be in danger, she added, her tone serious now. I'm asking you to meet with me for your own safety. Isaiah's thoughts raced. The walls seemed to close in on him. What was she saying? Was this just another ploy? Another manipulation from a department trying to save face? But she was offering him something that might give him the answers he needed. I'll meet you, Isaiah said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. Where? Tomorrow. I'll send you the details. The call ended, and Isaiah stood in silence for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. He turned to Marcus. You're not going to like this, he said, his voice dark, but I think I need to meet with her. Marcus looked at him, his expression filled with concern. You sure that's a good idea? I don't have a choice, Isaiah said, his voice growing firm. I'm not just fighting against a few bad apples anymore. There's something bigger going on. I need to know who's behind it. Marcus exhaled slowly. Just be careful, man. It feels like you're walking into something you can't come back from. Isaiah nodded, his mind already racing. Tomorrow would bring more answers, or more questions. Either way, he would face it. He had no choice but to find out what was really going on, and something deep inside him told him that it was going to get worse before it got better. Isaiah stepped into the dimly lit diner, his senses immediately sharpening. The air smelled of burnt coffee and grease, the kind of place where conversations were meant to be kept quiet. A bell jingled as the door shut behind him. Detective Sarah Wilkins sat in the far booth, her gaze fixed on him the moment he entered. She wasn't in uniform, just a dark blazer over a plain blouse, her badge clipped discreetly to her belt. Her posture was tense, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Isaiah took a deep breath and walked over. Mr. Bennett, she said as he slid into the seat across from her. Detective, he replied, watching her closely. Wilkins exhaled, setting her coffee down. I appreciate you coming. I know you don't trust me. Isaiah didn't respond. She continued. The officer who pulled his gun on you, Baxter, his firing wasn't as simple as it seemed. There's pushback from inside the department. And his partner, Officer Reynolds, he's been vocal about it. Isaiah narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? Wilkins hesitated, lowering her voice. It means Reynolds doesn't think this is over, and from what I'm hearing, he's not alone. Isaiah leaned forward, his jaw tightening. You're saying cops are coming after me? I'm saying you need to watch your back, Wilkins said. Baxter was reckless, but Reynolds, he's calculated. He's been on the force longer, and he knows how to play the system. Isaiah sat back, his mind racing. He had expected pushback, but this felt different. It felt like a warning. Wilkins continued. The official story is that Baxter's termination was justified, but off the record, there are officers who think this was about politics, about saving face. Isaiah clenched his fists under the table. And what do you think? Wilkins met his gaze. I think you got lucky that night, but luck doesn't last. Isaiah studied her for a long moment. He didn't know if he could trust her, but something in her voice, the way she looked at him, not through him, made him believe she wasn't lying. A sudden vibration from his pocket broke the moment. He pulled out his phone, a new message from an unknown number. You should have stayed quiet. His breath caught in his throat. His gaze flicked up to Wilkins, and for the first time he saw something that terrified him. She wasn't. Surprised, she already knew. Isaiah left the diner with his hands clenched into fists. The night air was cool, but his skin was burning with frustration, fear, and something else. Anger. Marcus was waiting for him outside, leaning against his car. He straightened when he saw Isaiah's face. That bad? Isaiah unlocked his own car, yanking the door open. Worse. Marcus walked over. "Talk to me." Isaiah took a shaky breath. "It's not over. That cop's partner, Reynolds, he's coming after me, and I just got a message." Marcus's expression darkened. "What kind of message?" Isaiah handed him the phone. Marcus read it, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Hell no," he muttered. "They're trying to scare you." "It's working," Isaiah admitted. Marcus shook his head. "No, man, that's what they want. You don't run, you fight." Isaiah exhaled. His entire life he had followed the rules, done what he was told. But now the rules were rigged. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "Last warning." Isaiah's hands trembled as he locked the screen. He looked up at Marcus. "I think I need to disappear for a while." Marcus stared at him, then shook his head. "No, if you run, you let them win. We figure this out." Isaiah ran a hand over his face. "I don't even know where to start." Marcus's eyes darkened with determination. "I do." The next morning, Isaiah and Marcus sat in Marcus's apartment, poring over files, articles, and reports. Wilkins had quietly sent over information on Reynolds. And it wasn't pretty. A history of excessive force. Complaints from civilians, but never once had he been disciplined. "They protect their own," Marcus muttered. Isaiah nodded. "Yeah, and now they're protecting him again." His mind was racing. The threats, the warnings, the tension that had been brewing since that night at the gas station. It was all leading to something. Something bigger than him. Marcus suddenly cursed under his breath. "Damn!" Isaiah looked up. "What?" Marcus turned the laptop toward him. "Reynolds has ties to a group of officers who have been investigated before. You heard about the Thin Blue Line Brotherhood?" Isaiah's stomach twisted. He had a network of officers who covered for each other, who pushed back against any attempts at reform. They had been investigated, sure, but nothing had ever stuck, and Reynolds was one of them. Isaiah exhaled. "This is worse than I thought," Marcus nodded grimly. "Yeah, and if they're coming after you, it's because they want to make an example out of you." Isaiah clenched his jaw. "Then we don't let them." That night, Isaiah's apartment felt different. The walls felt thinner, the shadows longer. He kept his gun on the table just in case. Then, a noise. Faint to a click, and outside the door, Isaiah went completely still. His heart pounded in his chest. He reached for his gun, his training kicking in. He moved silently, pressing his back against the wall, listening. Another click. The sound of a lock being tampered with. Someone was trying to get in. His breath slowed. He gripped the gun tighter. Then, bam! The door was kicked open. Isaiah moved. He spun out from behind the wall, gun raised. A dark figure in the doorway, a man in plain clothes, but Isaiah could see it. The stance, the Euro training. This wasn't some random break-in. The man froze for half a second when he saw Isaiah armed. Then he lunged. Isaiah fired. Once, twice. But the man dove behind the couch, narrowly avoiding the bullets. Adrenaline surged through Isaiah's veins. The man had planned for this. A gunshot rang out. A bullet tore into the wall behind Isaiah. He hit the floor, rolling behind the counter, his breathing ragged. He could hear the man moving, circling, calculating. Isaiah gritted his teeth. He wasn't going down like this. He peeked out. The man's face was shadowed, but Isaiah saw it. The glint of a badge, clipped to his belt, and that was when he knew Jaw. Reynolds had sent someone, maybe even come himself. This wasn't a threat anymore. This was a hunt. Isaiah's pulse pounded in his ears. His grip tightened on the gun. He had to end this. Now, he steadied himself, preparing to fire, but before he could, bang! Pain exploded in his shoulder. His vision blurred. He hit the ground hard, his gun skidding across the floor. A shadow loomed over him, a voice, low, cold. "Should have stayed quiet, soldier." Isaiah fought to stay conscious, but the pain was too much. His vision swam, the last thing he saw, before darkness took him. The glint of handcuffs and the smirk of a man who thought he'd already won.